Hello and welcome to this online launch for Mary Ann Lund's recently published book, A User's Guide to Melancholy. My name's Emily Hockley and I'm the commissioning editor for literature and theatre at Cambridge University Press. It's been such a pleasure to work with Mary Ann on this book and to see so many people engaging with it and enjoying her brilliance. Not least of all, Philip Pullman, who said he wishes her work remains in print for the next 400 years, which I obviously heartily endorse. So we're really delighted to welcome Mary Ann Lund today in conversation with Colin Gale, who is director of the Bethlem Museum of the Mind. But without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Mary Ann and Colin.
Thank you so much, Emily. I'm smiling to myself because I know you can't see one another, but I can see the list of who you are, and it's a great delight to see friends, family, students, colleagues, people I've known a long time, people for not much time at all, people I've connected with over Twitter and the internet, and readers, potential readers. So thank you very much for coming today.
And I'll introduce myself as well. I've already been introduced, Colin Gale, Bethlem Museum of the Mind director. I can't see myself, but I hope you all can see me and the fact that I'm zooming in from the museum's rather grand-looking boardroom. A couple of years ago, we hosted an exhibition here at Bethlem Museum of the Mind on the Anatomy of Melancholy. And I have a 1660 edition of the book right here. Can you see that? It's going to be seen, I hope so.
Yes, we can.
So the book was first published 1621, 400 years ago exactly, but this is just a little bit later. And of course, I've got Mary Ann's book itself. She and I first met when she visited and spoke to a museum audience about melancholy at the time of that exhibition. So, Mary Ann, congratulations, first of all, on the release of your book. I'm guessing this must be your first Zoom book launch?
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
But thank you very much, Colin.
It's my first as well. And of course, the book is a user's guide to melancholy, but also a guide to this wonderful book, The Anatomy of Melancholy, as well. And what I want to start by asking is, when we use the term melancholy, what do we tend to mean by it? And do we mean the same thing by it as was meant by the term melancholy 400 years ago when this book was published?
Thank you, Colin. I think that's a really good question to start off, because I think we come with a sense of melancholy, probably a post-German romantic notion of melancholy in terms of introspection, sometimes rather studied introspection, and a kind of gentle sadness, often of a very kind of intellectual type, and that can be the meaning. And it can also be a rather theatrical, assumed sense of sadness and solitude. But melancholy in the time of Robert Burton, the English Renaissance, and indeed in the Middle Ages and earlier, is a much more kind of all-encompassing term. So it's a blanket term for affliction of mind, body, and spirit. So it's very, very much about some physical symptoms as well as mental ones. So some of the things that we might today call depression, anxiety, psychosis, and mania and things, and all of those in the 16th and 17th century are encompassed by the word melancholy. Quite literally, it's a physical thing too. It's one of the four humours of the body, up there with blood and choler. So melancholy is black bile and phlegm. So melancholy is something that everybody has within them, according to ancient Galenic medicine. But it's when it becomes excessive in the body, or when one of the humours becomes corrupt, then it can cause a condition. Melancholy is an affliction. And one of the things that Burton distinguishes between is melancholy in disposition and melancholy in habit. So melancholy disposition is something that everybody experiences. He describes it as the condition of mortality, whereas melancholy in habit is when it gets more serious and entrenched and inescapable. And therefore it's a more extreme condition. I think Burton's interested in both of those things, and that kind of that sense of melancholy as a universal ailment, but also as something that is in quite particular terms. Holly is on the slides today, and I was wondering if you could flick over to slide 2, Holly, because perhaps one image of melancholy that might be very familiar to us is Dürer's etching of Melancholia as a female presence, the introspective, the downcast eyes, and that association of melancholy with genius and intellect. That the idea that goes right back to the Hippocratic writings and to pseudo-Aristotelian problems. Why is it, says that work, that people who are elevated in terms of politics and art and writing and philosophy are on the borderlines of madness? So that sort of cultural preoccupation becomes something very fashionable. At the same time, Holly, if you go on to the next slide, that we might know lots of these Renaissance portraits of usually of young gentlemen lying around in a shady spot near a brook on their own, painted in that kind of melancholic mode, like William Herbert. That was a long answer to start us off with, isn't it?
No, it's helpful. So it could be something gentle and reflective and almost fashionable, as you say, the condition of mankind or whatever. But then, again, as you say, it could be brutal, it could be hurtful, it could kill you. And that's an umbrella term, I guess, at that time. Yeah. And look, I want to ask you about another sort of start-off question about the author of the Anatomy of Melancholy, because he writes under the pseudonym of Democritus Jr. You can see that, yeah. But you've already dropped his surname once or twice. And actually, we've probably got a slide again, Holly. Thank you so much. I think slide 4 shows us the title page of the book, where there's a portrait just underneath the words in the middle there of the figure, Democritus Jr. Seems an unlikely choice of pseudonym, I would have thought. So tell us more about who the author actually was and why they chose that pseudonym.
Absolutely. Well, it was Robert Burton himself, but as you say, he didn't publish this work under his own name. If you just skip on to the next one, Holly, we'll see just a close-up of that top bit there. So above it, we've got a picture of Democritus, the Abderite. So there he is sitting in his garden, which looks suspiciously like a Tudor walled garden, doesn't it? And the story goes that Hippocrates, the physician, was asked by the people of Abdera to go and visit their local friendly philosopher because they thought he'd gone mad. And so Hippocrates popped along to this garden to find Democritus under a shady tree, dissecting animals, as you do. Hippocrates asks him why, and Democritus replies, well, he's looking for the source of madness because the world is clearly insane. Everybody is behaving disgracefully. People get very upset about the smallest of things. They pursue money. They don't pursue wisdom. I can't cut up humans, so I'm cutting up animals instead in the hope that they might yield the secrets of melancholy madness. There we go. It's even bigger now. And so Burton says, I am the heir of Democritus. I am following in his footsteps. And that sort of that anatomizing, as in dissecting, in order to find out what melancholy is all about. That's why he assumes that name of Democritus. The real man, I think in the next picture, was... I'm not aware that he was into dissecting animals himself. He was an Oxford man, although he was born in Leicestershire and grew up here, which is where I'm broadcasting from today. And he was a scholar. He was at Christ Church for all of his life. He never married. He never travelled. He wasn't a physician as well, although he's writing about a subject that preoccupied Renaissance physicians. He had no medical qualifications himself, so he was interested from various points, through voracious reading in medicine, philosophy, theology, but also all kinds of other things, including poetry. He quotes from Shakespeare, Chaucer. He quotes from La Celestina. All kinds of things involved in the writing of his book. So that kind of sense of omnivorousness is definitely in that book, and that's kind of part of what I wanted to reflect in the user's guide, that you kind of need a little bit of a bit of a guiding hand, because he is trying to compress and synthesize hundreds and hundreds of years worth of learning. And if I may squeeze in something else a little bit about Democritus, if you pop onto the next slide, Holly, the other thing about Democritus and is that he was seen as the laughing philosopher. So Heraclitus is the weeping philosopher. His response to the folly of earthly existence is to laugh, is to weep at it. Heraclitus mourns and laments all that's going wrong. Democritus, on the other hand, finds it ridiculous and laughs at it. And so those the two philosophers are twinned subject of many paintings, Velázquez and the like, that you see them kind of looking at the world as he does here in laughter. So there is also a sort of satirical edge to this too. And I think one of the interesting things about the Anatomy of Melancholy is the kind of tonal shifts. It's deliberately written like that. Burton talks of himself as like a ranging spaniel going through the landscape of melancholy and kind of bringing us as readers through it.
Okay, I find that really helpful, actually. So he's not cutting up animals, he's not cutting up people, he's not qualified doing it, but he's cutting up that overarching concept of melancholy, and he's got there are lots of ways to sort of break it down, its causes and its cures. And we do have a slide number 8, which where there's just an example of how he sort of is doing his subdivisions. It kind of looks a bit scary, doesn't it? And one of the things I like about your book is that it's rather simpler to access and to read, and you've done a really good job at making his sort of 1,000-page work accessible in that way. But what was he doing there in trying to break down the concept into all these different subdivisions?
Well, it's interesting because it's part of a project that goes on for a large part of Burton's life. He was born in 1577, died in 1640, and the first edition of the Anatomy of Melancholy came out 1621, so 400 years ago. That's why this is part of the 400th anniversary of the Anatomy. But that wasn't the end of the book. He kept on adding to it, and that wonderful copy you've got there is the kind of final version when he died, by which time it was more than about 500,000 words long. So it increased massively. And this division and division and division of things is also about exponential growth. Every time he finds one bit of melancholy to comment on, one facet, another bit comes in. You can see some of the divisions here and the kind of medieval scholastic divisions here. This bit, I think it's to do with, I can't read it particularly well, but there's some stuff about the soul and, you know, what makes the human soul, for instance, and what are the different causes of melancholy. Well, there's the supernatural causes. Melancholy comes from God, but then of course that's the natural causes, primary, secondary causes, and every time he gets another one and another one. So these wonderful synoptic tables are a kind of guide, but they're also a kind of representation of how deeply complex it is. If I may read from, this is a bit that was my kind of starting point in exploring the Anatomy of Melancholy. Burton is talking about melancholics themselves and how they present, to use a modern term. They will act, conceive all extremes, contrarieties and contradictions, and that in infinite varieties. Scarce 2 of 2,000 that concur in the same symptoms. The Tower of Babel never yielded such confusion of tongues as the chaos of melancholy doth variety of symptoms. There is in all melancholy similitudo dissimilis, like men's faces, a disagreeing likeness still. And as in a river, as we swim in the same place, though not in the same numerical water. As the same instrument affords several lessons, so the same disease yields diversity of symptoms. So as a result of that, it's almost impossible to pin down, but also that scarce 2 of 2,000 concur in the same symptoms mean that one person's individual experience of being melancholic can be quite unlike someone else's. The classic symptoms of melancholy are sadness and fear without an apparent occasion. That's sort of the hallmarks. But you might be melancholy and be neither sad nor fearful. You might be overtaken with hilarity. You remember the story that I feature in the user's guide, because he features lots and lots of case studies, and I wanted to get them in to here to personalize them. There's a story of someone who is in church and another person in the congregation sitting on a bench falls asleep during a boring sermon and falls off his bench. Everybody laughs at this, but this man is suffering from sanguine melancholy, and sanguine melancholy makes you excessively cheerful. And so when he sees this happen, he laughs, and he doesn't stop laughing for 3 days. And that kind of melancholy is obviously very different from the depths of despair that some people experience. And I think that's why these very complicated permutations exist and are part of what Burton is trying to represent here.
That's lovely. And those stories, I mean, they're poignant, but also slightly, almost too a little bit unbelievable as well. I hope we'll get a chance to come back and talk about that, or maybe someone will ask a question about it. We have got some questions coming in already, and I promise we will get to them. Some Shakespeare-related ones, just so you know, Mary Ann. But before we get there, I've got some other things I want to talk about. I want to go back to the title page, and there is, on slide 9, there's a sort of a close-up of some of the panels in that. Because as difficult as it is to categorize in this way, Burton does go ahead and do that. And there are some supposed causes or types of melancholy that are being depicted in this slide. Do you want to talk us through them, Mary Ann?
Yes, well,
or at least tell us what they are.
I will tell you about what they are. So on the top left, you have this man with a floppy hat pulled down over his head, and he is the innamorato. So he's the love melancholic. You might think of, I don't know, Malvolio and the Yellow Stockings, or any number of Shakespearean comic love melancholics. You could think of them. And so melancholy, which is to do with love or heroic, erotic melancholics. They might be people who become obsessed by their beloved, can't forget them, fall in love with the wrong person, fall in love with an animal. Burton even says that plants fall in love. He tells there's a wonderful story of palm trees that grow up and then grow towards one another because they're in love with one another. Bears, all kinds of extraordinary things. And then on the right, this chap who's leaning on his elbow on the chair, that's the hypochondriac melancholy. Now, that's a very particular kind, also known as windy melancholy. And the hypochondria, not as in feeling, worried that you're ill all the time, suffering from disease, but rather the hypochondrias, which is the middle region of the body and the torso, those organs. So it's a particular melancholy that can affect you from the liver and the stomach, can lead to windy symptoms, quite literally, can make you very lascivious, all those kind of things. So it's a remarkable thing. Then we've got superstitiosus, the religious melancholic. Of course, it's a Protestant. Robert Burton was a minister himself for the Church of England, and he has got, this is somebody carrying a rosary, and he sees religious melancholy, and Burton devotes a whole section to it as people who are excessively superstitious, people who experience transport, see visions, all those kind of things. And last of all, the maniac, the maniacus, is who has a chain on him. So that's somebody, if you think of Renaissance mental health as a kind of long spectrum rather than something that has lots and lots of different labels, at the more extreme end is the maniac, the somebody who is completely irrational or into the kind of frenzied state.
That's helpful. Yeah, here at the museum we have a statue of raving madness, chained like this fellow here. But then also in our medical records of a later time, 19th century, disappointment in love comes up quite a lot as a cause, as a contributory cause to whatever condition they're speaking about. But this isn't the love melancholy you started out talking about. Isn't disappointment in love it sounds to me you were saying it's actually love itself. That's
Yes.
that's the affliction, is it?
Absolutely. And that's where melancholy as the thing that affects everybody, and then melancholy as the disease, that the lines become very blurred. Burton has a lot of fun writing about melancholy, and he talks about when it comes to love stories. So that's where he's going to Chaucer and Shakespeare and things like that, and bringing up references from the classics and from poetry, because he's saying that, love is daft, really. He tells wonderful stories about people who do have physical afflictions too. There is a story of a physician who goes and visits a noblewoman. Her husband's away and she's suffering from a fever. And he thinks there's something not quite right here. This isn't just an ordinary fever. And so he takes her pulse. And as he is taking her pulse, he starts just chucking in the names of men that he knows are in her social circle. And then he gets to one name and her pulse starts to go uneven and race. And he realizes that she's suffering from love melancholy, and that this is because of an obsession, of course, with somebody, not her husband, I should say. And so there are many kind of case stories of people doing that or doing extraordinary things. Of course, because this is about the humours, which literally kind of the fluids of the body, that melancholy is the cold, dry humour. And so melancholy can come on through certain activities, sweating and fever being one, but also sex. That there is the story of the old man who marries a young wife in the summer, and immediately after their marriage he goes mad because he has really overexerted himself with, Burton's word is, chamber work, and then so he has to have kind of moistening remedies to cure him again.
And that's great. Shall we fast forward a bit and also talk about that character superstitiosus? Yeah, and that's and maybe hopefully an opportunity to tell us one more of Burton's anecdotes. And there's a chapter in your book devoted to this man, Francis Spira,
Yes.
who I understand at one time the story was just known throughout the breadth of Europe, although it's obviously forgotten now. So do you want to tell us that story?
I'd love to. Thank you, Colin. Burton's really interesting because he devotes a whole section to religious melancholy and treats it as its own section, and that's probably one of the only original things Burton does. Much of the rest of it is a pulling together of lots of other sources and then making them alive, making them his own. And he tells the story. He considers things like despair to be a form of melancholy. And Francis Spira was an Italian who lived, this was about the time of the Reformation, so the early 16th century. And he was part of a kind of North Italian Protestant community around the Venice region, who came under pressure. And he gets hauled up in front of the Inquisition, who force him to recant his Protestantism and goes, be Roman Catholic instead. And he does this because he's worried about his family and his friends and the effects on them. And he has to do it publicly. And more or less the moment he's done this, he experiences what he thinks is the voice of God speaking to him, telling him that he's damned. And in the subsequent weeks, he becomes more and more run down. He experiences more sort of voices. He's absolutely convinced that God has damned him, and that there is no hope, that he is under the wrath of God. And all kinds of people visit him. People try and convince him that he's melancholic and that this is to do with his humours and that he's simply medically unwell and he needs treatments. But he's a lawyer, and so he's very, very intelligent, and he's kind of, every game that they try and play on him, he has one better, and he will not believe this. He sort of preaches back to them, really. And he simply says, all of these things you say about God forgiving people, they're absolutely true for everyone except me. And over weeks and weeks, this goes on until eventually he dies. Depending on the account, in one or two accounts suggests that this is that he takes his own life. Others more that he simply kind of, he won't eat anymore, and so he kind of dies of his own despair. And the story gets recycled and reused. People like Calvin tell the story, and then it gets featured in all kinds of things for polemical purposes. Uncharitably, it's not thought that, you know, poor man, but rather this is a story of what happens if you recant. So it's kind of a strong story, but Burton features it among these stories of despair. Actually, it's where he ends the work on a quite compassionate note. The Cure of Despair is where he ends the book, and in the first edition it's just a couple of pages, and then it becomes 30 pages by the end. So he keeps putting in more things of, well, comforts really, and telling people not to listen to too many heavy Calvinist sermons, which sounds very wise.
I mean, this is really why I asked the question, because I think there is, although the story, okay, there are some time-bound elements to it, but I think there's something very poignant and contemporary about it as well. You know, on the one hand, someone could say, well, how can that really have happened? How can someone die of despair? But for every person who says that, there'll be another person who actually has the experience of that type of thing and say, actually, I know exactly what that feels like. You know, and my my mental state, I suppose, you know, it feels absolutely like a matter of life and death. And I think, see, on the one hand, he can be quite playful with these stories, and they can be quite extreme and out there. Some of the details, as I say, hard to believe. But yeah, another way, there seems to be a deep compassion and a humanitarianism, I suppose you wouldn't use that word, but nevertheless, about his use of these stories. I mean, obviously you've looked at these and many other stories. How do you see him using them?
I think that's right. I think there's a mixed approach. A lot of these stories about melancholics, people with strange experiences, strange delusions, they get recycled from one book to the next, and you know, Burton copies them from someone else who's kind of retailed and retold them, and you even get whole books about melancholy where here's a chapter of wacky stories of melancholics. Here's, you know, somebody who thought that they were made of glass, somebody who thought that if they urinated they would drown the whole town. And they definitely kind of, they've got that comical purpose, but they're also, I mean, they appear in that way in medical textbooks too. So they're about the many permutations of the human mind and what it can do, and indeed what physical things can happen. There's one of the stories I feature is of a man who goes to a fair, and he can't use the toilet properly. So for 10 days he gets constipated, and he starts being convinced that he has been burgled, that somebody's nicked all of his money. And people think that he's gone mad. And then luckily his physician realizes that the root of his problem really is just all in his bowels, and kind of sorts him out. And miraculously he's cured. So sometimes these things have these kind of physical source, but I think that they're being told to entertain and for their exoticism. I also think there's a sense in which Burton tells them as a kind of, well, it could be you too. There's a story, for instance, of a Jew in France who crossed a brook by night, and it was dangerous. He walked across a plank that was dangerous, and he got home safely. And then the next day, he came back to it and saw how what danger he had been in, and died of shock. And Burton says, you know, you might want to laugh at this or disbelieve it, but if you'd been in this situation, what would you have done? Sort of more or less. And so I think Burton is interested in that kind of destabilizing our sense of wellness, as well as offering a kind of comfort to those who are unwell. I think that's one of the things I find most compelling about Burton, is that he doesn't like complacency in any kind. So he wants to disrupt fixed illness, fixed melancholy, and that's one of the problems of melancholy. But he's also saying, well, if you're thinking you're above all this, watch out. Burton, of course, Burton, I should have said early on, he says, I write of melancholy by being busy to avoid melancholy. So he's sort of claiming that he himself is a sufferer and that he writes out of fellow feeling. And I think that's one of the ways in which the voice, or voices in the plural, of the Anatomy of Melancholy works so well, and gives such a sense of variety. I mean, he says, he talks to the patient as you, and then he gets the patient to answer back and say, well, this is sort of okay for you to say this, but we're stuck in this situation. We can't do anything to change ourselves. You might as well tell somebody who's got a fever to stop having a fever, or someone who's got a broken leg to stop having a broken leg, as somebody who's really melancholy to stop being melancholy. It's part of, it's in his blood. We can't move it. And he sort of sets up that dialogue. It's almost like he's the physician and then the patient, and he doesn't sort of allow one to have the last word.
I'm with you on that, but he's also interested in remedies as well, isn't he? And in some of those anecdotes you mentioned earlier, I mean, what was the remedy for the man who thought he was made of glass? What was the remedy for the man who thought that if he urinated, he'd flood the whole town?
Yeah. Yes, and he's certainly interested in remedies, and the second part of his book is all about that. I mean, they're as varied as the disease itself. That's probably the first thing to say about cures for melancholy. Some of them are instant cures, some of them are lifelong cures, and some of them are, he says, some of them are almost too impossible to do anything with. So the man who is convinced that if he urinates, he drowns the whole town, is his physicians put on a kind of theatrical event for him, where they because in that period, ringing the church bells in a certain way would be the kind of town fire alarm system. So they basically get that to happen. They get the bells rung. They set fire to something, the next door house, and they claim that the house next door has caught on fire, and they get the servants to run around going, fire, fire. And then they go to the man and say, you're the only one who can save us. And so he urinates. And the moment he does, he empties his overfull bladder, and he's cured of melancholy. That's the way that story ends. So sometimes in the cases of those melancholy delusions, that's a sort of participating in it, isn't it? It's a kind of getting involved, and also, I think, crucially, entering the reality of the disease, not questioning it and saying, no, you're wrong. Well, they tried that. They tried the logical persuasion route, and it doesn't work. So with melancholy, there's that sort of recognition that you have to work sort of through the patient's eyes. But there's also, I mean, a lot of it's about diet, things you should eat, things you shouldn't eat, exercise, fresh air, some very, some things that we know well, music, company, and various, there are some things like bloodletting and surgery, which I devote a chapter to, which are definitely not ones to be tried at home, but there is a whole range, and indeed a spectrum, depending on the severity of the case.
Yeah, and a lot of that sounds, some of it time-bound, but actually a lot of it, again, sort of, there's a contemporary resonance, which is hard to... Look, I'm a museum director, I'm not a clinician, and I think it's probably quite a good idea from a historian's point of view not to go overboard with the sort of parallels across the centuries, but can't help but hear some of those remedies that Burton offers and think, yeah, there's something I can relate to there.
Yeah.
Lots more to say, I'm sure, but I think maybe it was time we turn to some questions in the Q&A. And the first question came in at 4:00. So someone very keen, asking whether the guide to your book, or indeed Burton's book, would be a sort of a must-read for someone learning about, or indeed teaching, Shakespeare's life and works. And actually, while we're on that question, I'll draw in another one. can you comment on the iconic image of Hamlet as a reflective character on the brink of madness, and the melancholy with which Shakespeare was familiar?
Yeah, indeed. So thank you for these questions. I think that's Gurin. I hope I've pronounced that correctly. And Christina from Leicester. Hello. Nice to hear from you. Yes, well, the Shakespeare thing, absolutely. Obviously, there is a lot of melancholic characters in Shakespeare, sometimes used for comical purposes, being sent up in the Malvolio mode, consciously put on in Jakes from As You Like It as well. He's very known as the melancholy monsieur, or indeed the kind of Hamlet thing. Well, I think it's absolutely fascinating, of course, to read Shakespeare through that melancholy lens. But the Anatomy of Melancholy, it's later, it's 1621, so it's after Shakespeare's death, but is actually synthesizing an awful lot of Renaissance, medieval, and indeed ancient learning about melancholy. So although Burton himself, of course, is not an influence on Shakespeare, they are drawing on some similar kind of broader cultural knowledge there. In the case of Hamlet, where are we going? I always find, yes, Hamlet as a reflective character on the brink of madness and the understandings of melancholy. I think one of the important things to probably is to think about how medicine works in the period as something to which lay people, those who are not medical profession, have a kind of certain access to, and that melancholy is not part of a kind of professional sphere which is only dealt with by particularly qualified specialists. So there's a kind of cultural capital in melancholy, which is much broader. The people who write about melancholy that Burton's drawing on, a lot of them are continental physicians, especially from Italy and stuff, but they're not psychiatrists. They don't simply do diseases of the mind. They do all kinds of things. And likewise, the kind of people who would be treating you for melancholy would be treating all kinds of illness. The licensed practitioners, licensed with the College of Physicians, if you're more well off and able to access them, and indeed, lived in the city or near enough. But there's a whole range of unlicensed physicians too, and kind of lay healers. Burton himself, I'm going off the subject of Shakespeare, but I can't help myself. Burton talks about his mother, Dorothy Burton. So he came from a gentry family in Leicestershire, and talks about her own treatments of the people around her in rural Leicestershire. He tells this story about how she's done this thing about the nut. It's with a spider and a spider's web. And he's seen her, I think, performing this remedy and thought it was possibly nonsense. And then he reads about this in a learned book and thinks, gosh, well, I never. My mother was actually drawing on something that's a kind of got authority behind it. And then I think there's something a little bit self-deprecating there in the way he tells the story, but that the kind of tradition of medicine that was well known in the Midlands, of course, which is where Shakespeare comes from too, is something that where his bookishness kind of meets. It's not just about people who are in a very particular specialized way treating diseases of the mind. And I suppose that's why, a lot of it's about preventative medicine, things about diet and fresh air and exercise, which were part of that kind of wider culture of self-care, as we might call it.
Great. I'm going to put together two other questions as well. And please forgive me in advance if we don't get round to your question, and maybe there's something we can do after the seminar to do that. But the two questions that I think may relate to each other is, one person asked, does the 16th century English of Burton's book need a glossary for us in the 21st century? Actually, I can answer that. It needs a user's guide, so that we're not misled by a superficial reading. But we've got that. But actually, specifically, there's a question about hypochondria. People saying, actually, did Romanticism lead to a kind of like an explosion of that phenomenon? But again, I feel that there might be something here about the term hypochondria that we might be misled by if we think that he meant the same as we did.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. So I'm seeing those two questions. So it's Roger Gopalan asked the question about the 16th century one and whether it needs a gloss. And yeah, that other question as well. I think from Dave. Hello, Dave. I think there is a yes and no. Burton, I mean, it should be said, Burton, quite a lot of the Anatomy of Melancholy is lots of Latin tags. Burton claims he would have written the whole thing in Latin, but he wasn't allowed to. So he wrote it in English. I don't quite believe him. He often translates his Latin. But certainly, I think that there are bits which are harder to understand. Luckily, Angus Gowland is his edition from coming with Penguin in the summer is going to be have lots of notes which are very helpful, I think, for the reader. I think Burton has a kind of nice vernacular. He can often be quite colloquial. He doesn't sound stuffy and academic all the time. I don't know how you find it, Colin, but I am probably a stuffy academic. But he loves heaping up words, doesn't he? So even if you don't get the whole lot, you certainly get some of it. And there certainly are differences. But one of the things I find interesting about melancholy as a subject is that the words he uses to talk about mental affliction are ones that we might draw upon, but they're not always the language of kind of medical suffering. So he uses kind of anguish, anger, agony, affliction, distemperament, all those kind of things, which are rooted in Galenic medicine. And that Galenic medicine, even though they're kind of the language of the humours, is something that we will be kind of discredited in modern Western medicine. Nonetheless, I can see that Michael Schoenfeld's in the room, so I shall quote or cite him. One of the wonderful things he says, it does a great job, that Galenic medicine, of helping us, of finding words to describe what's going on inwardness. And I think that in the Anatomy of Melancholy, you get that too. So yes, there are differences, certainly, but also that expression of inner pain, inner suffering is, I think it continues to compel and speak to us, partly because it has that sense of connection with what it feels like from within, where perhaps some of our kind of modern medical labels might not, or might in a different way, who knows?
Following on from that, Brian Jenner asks, isn't Burton instructive because he sees the affliction as both mental and spiritual, and that modern medicine, it's all about, okay, so here's your prescription, take the antidepressants and you'll be fine. And maybe I don't know whether it's sort of too much of a stretch, but also to bring in the question about, is it the case that Burton is pathologizing Catholicism? As simple as that? Is it Protestant polemic? We're talking about Francis Spira earlier. So those two questions, I guess, on the spiritual aspects.
Yeah. Thank you for mentioning that. Burton, of course, is himself ordained minister, and he was a vicar in St Thomas's in Oxford as well. So one assumes he had some practical experience of pastoral care. And I think one of the things he says about melancholy is that it is a disease that needs a spiritual physician. And he talks of Christ as healer and physician, as a kind of exemplar for everybody. But the melancholy is a disease of body and mind and spirit. And so it needs a kind of, or a whole physician is the other thing. He's one who sees all of those different aspects. And I think what's interesting here is that kind of holistic sense is something that we are coming back to, but it's very complicated to administer apart from anything else in modern treatment. Some people, of course, are doing absolutely wonderful work in that. For instance, I'm thinking about the performing arts and the role of that in healing, and bibliotherapy as well, reading books, using the fresh air, and with some impressive results. Dialogue, conversation, that kind of support. I think Burton is is attuned to that sort of sense of that often melancholy can be in a really ultimate sense about the kind of why are we here, a kind of existential thing, but also, of course, he's seeing it in terms of an experience of faith, and faith and doubt. So he's what I like. I think he's unflinching, Burton, in talking about that. He's certainly also using it to come back to the other question about Catholicism, Protestantism for polemic effect, and he's putting the Church of England as the kind of the middle ground that is the accepted bit, and seeing on the one hand the kind of superstitions, and he talks about Puritans as well, of course, and there's little time for them, but he talks about the kind of people who read too many kind of heavy tracts and listen to too many condemnatory sermons, and he says that really we should stop doing all of that kind of thing if we're suffering. So he sort of tells people sometimes just to cool it off a little bit, really, if their religious fervour is actually what's making them unwell.
Lovely. Okay, so here's some fabulous questions, and we're not going to be able to do them all, but let's try a few more. How easy is it, being that melancholy is fashionable, how easy might have been to emulate or feign melancholy? Are there any potential repercussions if an individual has found out? I think there's a bit of Rosenham and Spitzer here, the sort of the 1970s experiments around whether feigned insanity could be found out. Any reflections? I mean, if there's not, but on that one.
Well, people pretending to be.
Yeah,
well, we're back to Hamlet as well, of course, aren't we? Putting an antic disposition on. Now, does Burton have anything to say about that? He has, he has something to say about almost everything. So sometimes hard to remember the precise thing about that. You certainly see people testing symptoms, and whether people are quite what they seem to be appearing. I've just noticed another question in the chat which might be linked to it, from Sue Allen, who asks about the role of the imagination and mental illness and imagination, and suffering. Can you feel anxiety without it, and depression, etc.? And I think that might be interestingly linked to it, because absolutely, so that it's about the melancholy is a disease of the imagination. So it's when it becomes diseased. So you are possibly seeing things that aren't there, or you're having false memories. And it's the things that are outside that kind of go in, but also things that your mind is creating that you think are there and are not. So a typical experience with people seeing kind of phantoms, or thinking they're seeing ghosts, or people following them about. And often, interestingly, that becomes racialized in the period. Melancholy is a black humor, and so there are lots of case stories of people seeing black figures. So the kind of it's literally a kind of melancholy sunglasses thing, or maybe melancholy contact lenses. Yes, because the story goes that they have the blackness in the fluid, and it kind of affects what they're seeing, so that everything outside goes dark, and what is within projects itself outside, and becomes an object of fear, which you can very much see in racialized terms there, I think. But I think then, just to go back to your question, Colin, the point about feigning or pretending, there is that sort of, sometimes you get the testing out of imaginative things and whether the imaginative is real, but also a lot of playing along with the imagination and what it does, which is what I find absolutely fascinating. That kind of, again, that entering the world of delusion.
And Meg asks really pertinent question, which maybe we should have started here. What was Burton's intended audience? He seems to be a cross between DSM-5, which is just about the same size, and Oliver Sacks.
Yeah.
And I wonder, there's something here about who was he writing for? I mean, obviously, it'd be interesting to know what he thought about that. But there's a sense in which I think you'll probably want to say he was writing for himself. but clearly it resonated with a lot of other people.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's interesting. I noticed John Edwards has also asked a question about differences between Burton and Timothy Bright. So, I mean, one of the things is that because he's writing in English rather than Latin, he's going beyond the kind of rather limited audience of elite medical writers who are writing and reading in Latin for one another, and taking his audience wider. Burton's sort of predecessor on English medicine is Timothy Bright, who wrote a treatise on melancholy in the 1580s, which is a considerably shorter tome and a lot less funny. But it's a book that's entertaining. I mean, he says that he's writing for people, for a variety of people, including those who don't suffer from it. He's rather worried about people who do suffer from it doing a kind of medical student syndrome and picking up more through reading it, convincing themselves that they are suffering from particular things. So he does warn them, don't read the symptoms. I don't know how helpful that is. I always think that's a bit of a joke. Don't read this bit of my book. It's on page 49. Yeah. But I think he kind of has that wide scope. I know, obviously, this is a book that would have been expensive. You've got there a folio production and a very large one at that. So this would not be within the scope of all readers by any means. What we do know about Burton's readers, I mean, I had a great time a long while ago looking at all of the scribblings that people have put in the margins of his book, which are absolutely wonderful and often very funny in themselves. There's one reader wrote, "Now you are mad," at a particular point. We know women who read The Anatomy of Melancholy too. So there is a poem about a woman who read Burton's Anatomy, and it's saying, here you might find not to suffer but to read your cure. So Burton's interested in helping people, and I think that was kind of recognised by his readers too. There's some evidence of people who were suffering and read it for that reason.
And did you want to say something about the sense of him writing for himself in part?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yes, one must scratch where it itcheth. Lovely image. That he's writing. I mean, he's writing to find out more about the disease. So through knowledge, but this kind of lifelong project where he keeps writing. He sort of acknowledges there's an obsessive quality to it, and it becomes almost something that's symptomatic of his own experience of it, that he can't stop himself. So it becomes part of that kind of learned project. I'm thinking of work of people like Katie Murphy, for instance, who have done wonderful things about knowledge systems in the Renaissance. But that's almost, it's been suggested he's almost parodic. I think it's probably going a bit too far, but the whole thing's a parody because it's a massive, if it's a joke, it's quite a large joke, really, isn't it? But it's taking things to an extreme. But there is that sense of with Burton that he almost can't stop himself.
There's a bit here which I love. I suppose it's sort of unintentionally sort of contemporary, I guess, this whole project, which is culminated today, and the publication of your book must have started before COVID. But the story of Cardano, who didn't think of himself as being restricted until someone told him he couldn't go out. Were we enjoined to go to such and such places, Burton writes, and this is in your book, we would not willingly go, but being barred of our liberty, this alone torments our wandering soul that we may not go. A citizen of ours, says Cardano, was 60 years of age and had never been forth of the walls of the city of Milan. The prince, hearing of it, commanded him not to stir out. Slightly, why would he do that? But anyway, being now forbidden that which all his life he had neglected, he earnestly desired, and being denied, he died for grief. Sort of, as I say, a bit sort of like a little bit too contemporary, really, in the period of lockdown, hopefully, that we're coming out of now.
Absolutely.
Perhaps Burton would have thought of us as being suffering from a collective, a melancholic experience.
Absolutely, yes. I think that is a bit that speaks to us, particularly during this long lockdown right now, all through the winter and the grimness of it. Thank you, Colin.
Last thing I'll go, and as I say, perhaps if we can find another way of getting back to the questions outside this event, we'll do that. But there are hints in your book about the potential that reading itself has, as well as, you know, Burton was writing as a form of self-therapy, but he must have done a most enormous amount of reading. And I myself am a keen reader, but I don't read self-help books. I don't find them in any way helpful. But actually, I've really, really enjoyed your book. I think there's something about Burton's realism that you introduce us to, or why is it that actually self-help books don't help me, but I warm to this this style of writing? What would Burton have said about it, do you think?
What would Burton have said about self-help as a whole, as a strategy? Probably far too much about concentrating on yourself and not just getting out there and having a nice walk. I think he probably would have said something like that. I don't know, but I agree with you very much about that. Self-help doesn't do it for me either in that way, but I find the kind of shifting peculiarities and the kind of exuberance of Burton and the multi-voicedness so much more appealing.
Brilliant. Thank you so much to Mary Ann and Colin. It's been a fascinating discussion. We're sorry if we didn't get to your question. I've rarely seen so many questions flying in for an event, so it's great to know how much everyone's engaged here.
I was going to say, Emily, I will read them all and I'll try and find some different formats in which to answer them, kind of maybe do another blog for you or do a video or two or something, and I'll put some things up on Twitter as well, because there's some wonderful questions and I really appreciate, I can see all your names in the chat. It's lovely to see you all, so I'll try and do that.
Brilliant. Yeah, it certainly raised my spirits, so thank you very much.